Well, for more on the protest and Colombia's economy, CGTN's Rachelle Akuffo spoke to Sergio Guzman. He's the director of Colombia Risk Analysis. He begins by explaining how Colombia got to this point.
One of the things that make the protests last a long time are two things. The first one is the diversity of the people who are protesting. And the other thing is the government's response to the protesters. In this occasion, the protesters were made up by students, by taxi drivers, by truck drivers, by workers' unions. There was a full gamut of different actors trying to participate in the protest. And the government's response to many of the protests was condescending communications, but then a real strength in numbers of police members and several acts of police harassment and very forceful policing that became the glue and gave these protests a different direction.
So obviously then, as you mentioned, a lot of different groups in here. What are some of the issues that they really want the government to address right now, especially the economic issues?
Well, there's a lot of things that they want. The first thing in their demand sheet is the full implementation of the peace agreement, which, as you know, was signed in 2016. And this government has been very hesitant to implement some of the main parts of the agreement. But on the economic reforms, people are really reeking from the COVID situation. They really want some form of universal basic income. They want free tuition for university education. They want lower tolls around the country for the truck drivers. And the taxi drivers in particular, they want the government not to regulate the transportation apps or to actually outlaw them because they're the natural competition. So there's a whole gamut of things. Some of them the government could meet. A lot of them the government has no political or fiscal room to meet. So really what many of the protesters are looking for is a dialogue, is a negotiation where they can give a little and they feel that the government is conceding also, but there's not a lot of trust between the two sides to actually come to a fruitful dialogue.
So then, of the president's economic plans, which ones do you think could address this situation?
Well, I think first and foremost, the country needs an economic recovery. And that's no doubt about it. I think that the president wants that, the opposition wants that, everybody wants this country to be much more prosperous. The president also had insisted on unconditional cash transfer scheme to help the most vulnerable, to help the poorest quintiles of society get through this very difficult situation. And unequivocally, that was a good policy. The problem is who should pay for that? According to the government's program, it should be the middle class and people who don't regularly pay taxes who should cover the majority of the costs. According to the opposition, it's the wealthiest, the big businesses, who should be shouldering the majority of these overhead costs. And so that's really the impasse. Who should pay for this additional fiscal spending?
So then do you see a path forward in terms of a way to the middle of this?
Actually, it really depends on how the government decides to negotiate. I think the government has been given some room by different trade associations, by different trade unions and sectors saying, look, we're happy to give up some of the tax cuts that this government had prior given us so that we can restore economic activity because this is hurting us all. So the government has a very clear way out. The problem is that this government would basically be admitting that it's taking back the majority of the economic measures that it implemented. So it would be, in a way, erasing its own legacy by giving in to some of these requests.
So then as we look at where Colombia was pre-pandemic, what were the main economic drivers and how are they faring now?
They're very similar to what they are now. I mean, the pandemic has only made things like youth unemployment worse, inequality worse, abstention from schools worse, rural hunger and inequality, and also the vacuums of power in rural areas, how the state had not yet began to provide basic goods and services to a lot of the people living in rural areas. So these were all things that were going on pre-pandemic that the pandemic just made the problems deeper.